Hello, my name is Daniel Schoonmaker. I'm the Executive Director of West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation on the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. For those that are not familiar with our organization, the forum is a collaboration of businesses and institutions dedicated to promoting practices that advance climate leadership, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy. We host events and programs throughout the state, including this monthly Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. The webinar series is presented by Shupan with additional support from Foresight Management and the Environmental Defense Fund. Our next in-person event is our annual member meeting on Monday, June 27th at the Grand Rapids Center for Community Transformation. This will feature our annual business meeting and a panel discussion headlined by Congressman Peter Meyer and Vicki Lewis of EMX Enterprises. We also have a number of upcoming networking events in Grand Haven, Midland, and Berrien County. We hope to see you at one of these this summer. And if you're not local to any of these, you see listed on screen, feel free to DM my colleague, Rose Spickler, and she will let you know when we will next be in your area. Our webinar series continues on August 16th with a presentation from the Biodegradable Products Institute, which will include a briefing on potential opportunities to advance compost in the Farm Bill and the proposed Compost Act. Finally, please do consider becoming a member of the forum and support this important work. Now I'd like to introduce our program for today, how proposed SEC rules could impact climate action in Michigan. For our attendees, please note that you can share thoughts and questions with the panelists or all attendees through the chat function. We will have time at the end of the presentation for open questions and answers. Our panel today includes Mike Trupos, Vice President of Foresight Management. Mike is Managing Director at Foresight Management with certified energy manager and certified procurement professional designations from the Association of Energy Engineers. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Calvin University. Mike is a self-declared energy nerd who has spent the last 10 years learning everything he can about the energy management industry. He thrives off the complex and rapidly changing Sorry, just went offline for a second there. He thrives off the complex and rapidly changing nature of energy sustainability. Mike is in his element when empowering industrial companies to come up with a plan on how to reduce energy consumption and cut utility costs. Thank you for joining us today, Mike. But first, introducing the proposed rules is Alexandra Thornton, the Senior Director of Tax Policy and a member of the Business, Government, and Workers team at the Center for American Progress. Alex writes and speaks on tax, capital markets, and fiscal policy issues, including individual and corporate taxation, wealth taxation, tax administration, corporate governance, climate and human capital disclosures, and regulation on investment fiduciaries. Her background also includes nearly 10 years as tax counsel to a member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance, experience in nonprofit management focusing on international conservation, environmental taxation, and litigation and private law practice. Thank you for joining us, Alex. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. Can I do that at this point? There we go.
Yes, you can.
All right. Let me know if this works. Are we seeing the first slide?
We are, Alex. Looks great.
Excellent. Thanks. So, and thank you for that introduction, Dan. As you know, the Securities and Exchange Commission is proposing to require public companies to disclose information about their climate-related risks, including some disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions associated with their business. And the public comment period for this rule is June 17th. It ends June 17th. And I'm going to provide a brief overview of the proposed rule, including what it does and what it doesn't do. I want to emphasize that while having companies be transparent about the climate risks they face could help our economy transition to low carbon ways of doing things, the SEC does not have authority to solve climate change. Its responsibility is to protect investors by ensuring they have the information they need to make investment decisions, information that's relevant to the valuation of securities. And this is central to why Congress created the SEC more than 8 decades ago. Since that time, the basic bargain has been that companies are free to seek capital from the public as long as they provide the information investors need to make investment decisions. And a growing number of both institutional investors and retail investors are seeking the the financial risks are worried about seeing the financial risks that climate change poses, and they're asking for climate risk and emissions information from the companies they invest in. So I want to start out just by pointing out that climate experts and businesses divide climate risks into two categories. They're physical risks and transition risks. So physical risks can result in damage to a business's physical assets, and they consist of climate-related changes in the business's physical environment, such as more severe wildfires, hurricanes, floods, heat waves, drought, temperature increases, and sea level rise. Transition risks consist of technological and market and other changes in the economy as it transitions toward less polluting options. So examples of transition risks would be changes in policies, changes in consumer, investor, or employee behavior and choices, changes in technology, changing demands of business partners, and shifts in market prices. So how a company assesses and manages these risks and its level of emissions can affect its business operations, its financial statements, its supply chains, its profitability, and indeed its long-term survival. So we know that climate change is already driving significant economic harm. In the last 2 years alone, the US has seen over 40 weather and climate disasters that have cost each $1 billion or more. And a report from a leading business disclosure framework found that 215 of the world's largest companies face nearly $1 trillion in climate-related risk. And climate-related risk is so significant and widespread, affecting every state in the country, not to mention all our trading partners, that the US Financial Stability Oversight Council has determined that climate change is an emerging threat to the financial stability of the US. So it's actually a threat to the financial system. And every business could or likely will be affected either directly or indirectly by the physical and transition risks of climate change. So investors want a better understanding of what that means for each company they invest in. Large investment companies that manage investment funds like mutual funds or manage investment of retirement savings or pensions of tens of millions of Americans want this information, but also individuals or retail investors want this information and arguably need the SEC to require standardized disclosures of climate risk even more because individually they lack the resources or the capacity to find it. So what is the current status of climate-related disclosures? Well, at present, many public companies disclose no climate-related information at all. Among those that do, the information is really hard to find whether it's in the financial statements, whether it's in the narratives and other published materials that the company has that they don't necessarily file with the SEC. And the data and methodologies on which those disclosures are based is rarely disclosed. And companies also use a lot of different standards, and these standards have different terminology, different types and levels of disclosure. And often the disclosed information isn't verified, audited, or verified in any way. And investors can't rely on it, and even if they could find it, and they can't compare companies on the basis of this risk in order to make investment decisions. So next I want to look at the authority of the SEC. The SEC has the authority to protect investors by requiring public companies to disclose hidden risks when they are hidden risks of the companies they're investing in. So this would be information that investors want and need in order to value securities and make investment decisions. The SEC can also ensure that information is reliable and consistent and comparable across companies by standardizing formats, location of where information is disclosed, data, and methodologies. But what I want to make clear is that the SEC lacks the authority to tell companies what to do. They can't tell them to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, nor can they tell investors where to invest their capital. For the SEC, it's all about disclosure. So let's look now at what disclosures the rule would require. The there's about 510 pages in this proposed rule. Much of it is discussion. The actual proposed amendments to the regulations are much shorter. But, and there are a lot of important details, but there basically are 4 categories of disclosure. And these categories of disclosure are divided between the 2 types of reporting that companies do. One is governed by Regulation SX, and it's related to the financial statements. And the other type of reporting is governed by Regulation SK, and it's the more narrative part of the filings that public companies make to the SEC. So the first 2 categories of disclosures are in SX, in other words, the financial statements, and the second 2 are in SK, the narrative statements. So the first category is the financial impacts of physical and transition risks that are reasonably likely to have a material impact on the business or its financial statements in the short, medium, and long term. So this is a line-by-line disclosure of the impact of physical and transition risks of climate change. So examples would be changes to revenues or costs from disruption of operations or supply chains from climate events, changes to insured losses due to impact of severe weather, changes to revenues due to changes in consumer purchases, or changes in the carrying value of assets due to changing technologies now used by competitors. The second category of disclosure in the financial statements is expenditures. So what is the company in aggregate spending to address those risks? And it has to be separated by expenditures and by amount of capital costs incurred. So then in the narrative part of the financial statements, the third and fourth categories of disclosures are greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm going to cover in the next slide, and actually my last slide. And then the fourth category is whether the company is integrating assessment and management of climate-related risk into its core business functions. So there's a group of disclosures that are related to that in governance and strategy and its risk management and its goals and targets. How is the company, if it is at all, integrating assessment and management of climate-related risk? And then they would need to disclose those processes. So the proposed rule is centered upon a requirement to disclose information and doesn't mandate changes in management practices. And then I want to go into a little more detail on greenhouse gas emissions because that's something that a lot of folks are focusing on. But I did also want to say that another really important aspect of the rule is that it sets out specific parts of the company's periodic reports where the information has to be listed. So the financial statement disclosures have to be in a note to the financials. If there's a line item that's impacted, there's a note to that line item where that's explained. And then the narrative part, the ones that the greenhouse gas emissions and the integration of climate risk into business functions, that is in a narrative part. It's in a especially separately captioned section of the narrative part of the report so that investors can find it. So I want to go to my last slide then, which is a little more detail on the emissions disclosure. So I want to make sure everybody understands that there are sort of 3 types of emissions that are focused on by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is a globally known and used framework for disclosing emissions. And the SEC's rule refers to that. It doesn't totally incorporate it, but it uses it to structure its emissions disclosures. Scope 1 disclosures are emissions from the company's operations, things that are completely within the company's control. Scope 2 emissions are purchased energy. So if a company doesn't manufacture, produce energy on its site for its operations, it may purchase energy. And so the Scope 2 emissions are purchased energy emissions. Scope 3 emissions, which are the ones that seem to be so controversial, are basically emissions from up and down a company's supply chain. it's from its suppliers all the way down to the use of its products. So in the SEC proposed rule, all public companies have to disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions, but it's phased in. And I should point out that there are no offsets allowed for this purpose. So if a company purchases carbon credits from some, organization that does, protects against deforestation in Africa or something, they can't count that against their emissions disclosure. They have to disclose their absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions. But only accelerated and large accelerated filers must have their scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosures verified. And they have to be verified by an official greenhouse gas emissions attestation provider, which is laid out in the proposed rule. Now, scope 3 emissions, supply chain emissions, are only required for accelerated and large accelerated filers. Smaller reporting companies are exempt. And generally speaking, smaller reporting companies are companies with a public float, in other words, public shares outstanding of 250 million or less. They could even have up to 700 million shares outstanding as long as their revenues were less than 100 million annually. So there's quite a large exemption there for smaller reporting companies. And then the larger companies that have to report scope 3 emissions only have to do so if those scope 3 emissions are material or if the company has made a commitment to reduce its scope 3 emissions. And materiality would be like if it was significant amongst its total emissions. If its scope 3 emissions were like 90% of its total emissions, then it would have to disclose those emissions. And then there's a broad liability safe harbor specifically for scope 3 disclosure. So as long as a company makes a good faith effort to estimate its scope 3 emissions, it really has nothing to worry about in terms of liability. And there's no attestation required. There's no, which is something that my organization is concerned about, that there's really no verification required of those scope 3 emissions disclosures. So I just wanted to point out, that the rule came out March 21st. We're in the comment period now. The comment period ends June 17th. We do not know when the final rule will come out, but we're hoping by the end of the year. And we hope it will be finalized by the end of the year. And we do anticipate that it will be challenged in court, but the rule will probably continue to go into effect even as that's happening. And I think that concludes my remarks. Dan?
Thank you so much, Alex. Sorry, I had to mute myself there. Mike, you looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. And then again, we'll have an open Q&A after at the end here.
Certainly. So Alex, thanks for that overview. That was really helpful. So Dan asked me to come on and talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in the business community around these SEC rules. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time to talk about if you're a public company, what we're seeing, how they're responding, the nature of just reporting in general. And then I also want to talk to private companies. I imagine there's a number of private companies here too, wondering, does this affect me? And the short answer is going to be, it absolutely does. And we can talk about some of the ways that that's going to function. And then we can go into some detail. I think Alex did a nice job explaining scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I want to kind of help you understand where are most organizations at on their scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting journey, because I think it could very quickly, when you see how nebulous scope 3 reporting is, I think a lot of companies freak out and think they're really far behind. However, the reality is there's a lot of companies that haven't really figured out scope 3 yet. So we can talk about some strategies around that. So, all right, let's jump in. I'll just say this, Alex finished with the comment period and what's going on with this SEC ruling. It's my professional opinion as someone who follows the energy and sustainability world that this will not go into effect right away. I think the reality is this will hit, and it'll probably happen in, I would say, probably the next 1 to 3 years. There's certainly a decent amount of people pushing back on this rule. However, there are a lot of other factors driving carbon reporting in the public markets. And so if it was the federal government that was leading alone on this, I think that it could potentially die and never actually make it to being a real rule. However, I'll talk about a couple trends that we're seeing. One is BlackRock, which you guys have probably all heard of. They are the single largest asset holder. So when you think about your 401k or your 503b retirement, very high likelihood that if you've bought some sort of index fund or some ETF like the S&P 500 or whatever, that is a fund that you've bought through BlackRock. They're not the only one, but they're the largest one. They have trillions, literally trillions of dollars under management. And the CEO there named Larry Fink has come out pretty aggressively the last number of years in his letters to CEOs, basically telling publicly traded companies, climate risk is investment risk. And he's basically said, we vote on your shares. So if you think about it, you're a publicly traded company, you do annual votes, and they're basically saying, we're going to vote for climate disclosures on all the shares that we hold. We're going to push you to be more sustainable. And a lot of public companies have taken note just from BlackRock leading the way and saying, hey, this is a big deal. So again, this is not like the SEC's rule came out of the middle of nowhere. It's actually really not all that different from what we're seeing Larry Fink and BlackRock pushing on their suppliers. And then I would also be remiss to just say, like, beyond the regulatory thing of like the government pushing companies to do this, and beyond the like big boogeyman of BlackRock as a major investor pushing companies to do this, we're just seeing a general appetite in the consumer space. So I think the easiest example I can give, and it's probably close to home, is the story of Tesla and just how much Tesla has exploded in popularity over the last 5 years. But then if you look at the stock, Tesla stock, I know it's come down quite a bit, but it for a while there, it was worth more than General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, and you could probably throw in Toyota and Honda as well. It's worth more than all of those companies combined. Even though last year they delivered about 1 million cars, and all the other brands I just talked about delivered between 5 and 10 million. And so what's happening is companies in general are taking note of the Tesla story, which is you have a bunch of consumers that are resonating with a brand and the sustainability associated with that brand. And so now we've started to see really bold sustainability statements come from companies like General Motors and Ford. And so this is like beyond the rules from the SEC and beyond BlackRock. We're just seeing companies realize if we're going to be competitive in the landscape right now, we need to be talking about how we're going to adapt to climate change and how we're going to be part of the solution. And so things like science-based targets initiatives and reporting are all actually happening from a voluntary standpoint with many companies, especially companies that want to develop their brand and resonate, especially with younger consumers and millennial and Gen Z. So that's like a big picture thing. If, like I said, if the SEC was doing this in a vacuum, it might not happen. But I actually think that a lot of these companies aren't really going to fight this as hard as we think they are, because they have all these other reasons to do it anyway. And so they're sitting here saying, yeah, great, the SEC is going to mandate this, but we have shareholders that we have to keep happy and we have customers that we have to keep happy. So whether the SEC does it or not, we're going to do it anyway. And beyond that, I also just think, like I said, there's just a lot of companies that maybe are waiting, but we're also seeing a lot of the companies who are saying, yeah, I'm not really getting that much pressure from BlackRock, and I'm also really not getting all that much pressure from my customers. Maybe you're embedded further down in the supply chain. These public companies are just saying, hey, this is a business risk. If this thing passes and we don't have a plan, we're going to have to scramble. So we think that this is going to be good for our business anyway, and so we'll invest in it. And that's what we're seeing is companies are saying, we're excited that we have a 1 to 3 year window to basically comply with the regulation. We're going to take that window to get a head start instead of waiting to the very last minute and having to scramble. So big picture, that's where I'm seeing a lot of the businesses getting pressure around, and also where I'm seeing businesses take a look at doing this. And I'll just say, beyond all the external pressures, I think there's starting to be a growing internal drive for organizations to do this. There's a few things that are happening right now that we won't talk about in detail, but are just a reality in the world today. The big one is energy. I think we all understand that there's a major conflict between Russia and Ukraine right now, and Russia is the single largest producer of energy in the globe. And so that has thrown the energy markets into a whole lot of chaos. So most of our business clients are realizing utilities are a major cost center. And in fact, there's a significant amount of volatility associated with the energy markets right now. And so they're saying, we want to be more efficient and more sustainable anyway, because that means we have lower utility costs. And frankly, the lower we can squeeze our utility costs, the less volatility we have and the less risk we're sitting on from things like wars and supply chain squeezes and other issues in the energy world. And so you're seeing this internal push where companies are saying, I want to work at a company that's really progressive. I want to work at a company that's sustainable. And frankly, we have goals and budgets, and we want to hit our budgets for energy costs. So we're trying to invest in as much sustainability and energy efficiency and renewable energy as we possibly can, because that will begin to diminish what we're spending on utilities, which helps us from a financial standpoint, but also back to what Alex was talking about in your scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions reporting. If you use less utilities, so electricity and natural gas, then you will have lower greenhouse gas emissions that you have to report out to your shareholders. Finally, it's just an operational thing. If you think about it, you have input costs, especially, and this is more focused towards manufacturing, but a lot of the people on the call, I think, are manufacturing. Certainly, if you can reduce your input costs in a time like this where inflation is rising, that certainly is good in the fact that you hold more pricing power and can potentially hold more profits. And so a lot of companies are also seeing if we can streamline operations, bring our supply chain closer to the US or closer to where we're assembling things, as well as reduce our utility consumption, we're a little bit more insulated from the major inflation and uncertainty and volatility there. So beyond all the pressures that I'm talking about from an external standpoint, I do want to just highlight that, like, we're not going to spend any more time on this webinar on this, but things like inflation and wars and energy pricing, if the more you can insulate yourself from that as a business, the more competitive you can be, and the less you have to find yourself scrambling to come up with a plan and to figure out a way out of it. So that's all the public stuff, I guess, I want to talk about. So again, that's all the drivers that we're seeing with public companies around this SEC ruling and just in general for reporting out their carbon emissions. Let's pause a second and say there are a lot of privately held companies here in West Michigan and across the country as well. And so if you're at one of those private companies, you might be wondering, Mike, is this really all that relevant to me? A bunch of public companies may be getting the screws put in them in 1 to 3 years from the SEC. Like, why should I care? And I'll go ahead and just talk about a few scenarios. One is a lot of private companies are private equity or PE owned. And PE companies that we've been talking to are taking this just as seriously as the public companies are. There's a few reasons for that. One is we all know PE companies love buying other companies. They're big in M&A. So mergers and acquisitions, they want to buy up other companies. They want to roll them all up and they want to spin them out. So there's a lot of transactions. A lot of companies that are PE held end up transacting more frequently, changing hands between PE firms, et cetera. And these PE firms aren't dumb and they want to get their money back. And they're realizing that Alex spent a significant amount of time talking about all of the things associated with like regulatory disclosures. And if you're a public company, you have to report your financials in a very specific way. PE firms are seeing the same scenario with ESG. They're saying we have to clean up the financials of these private companies we own. We also have to have an ESG plan. We actually really need to be able to quantify and value the metrics for ESG, environmental, social, and governance, including carbon, so that as we're looking to sell this, other PE firms are going to want to know this, and we have this at our fingertips. And so we're seeing for sure PE is a big driver in a lot of this ESG metric tracking as well, because they want to be able to divest. They want to know what kind of risk they're getting themselves into. And frankly, when you look at exit strategies, other exit strategies for PE companies or just small companies in general are, one, to be spun off into an IPO or initial public offering. That puts you in the markets. We're right back where we just started talking about. Or many of these private companies get sold up to public companies. We see that as well. A lot of our industrial clients that we work with are buying up smaller privately held industrial clients. If you're a publicly traded company and you go down and you try to buy a private company and you can get good visibility into these ESG metrics, there's a high likelihood that you as the private company can demand a higher valuation. So that's like the cold side of the privately held market, is if you're capable of complying with a lot of this stuff, even though it doesn't apply to you, and if you're capable of quantifying it, you get all the benefits I just talked about: lower utility costs, lower volatility. But you also have the ability now to be able to talk about what you're doing and say, hey, if you buy me, you don't have to go cleaning up a bunch of messes. and you don't have to worry about what kind of risk you're walking into. Because again, the other piece that Alex talked about is companies need to be able to quantify the climate risks associated with the business. And so you as a private company, if you already know that information, you will get a higher valuation. And so that's the big landscape we're in. Actually, the day after the SEC released this, I sat on a panel at another organization which was talking about this. And actually a guy in the back raised his hand and said, I'm a privately held family-owned business. We just sold out. We've been running this thing for 50 years. And we just sold out to a private equity firm. And he goes, I can affirm exactly what you just said. We did not have any ESG screenings done, and they made us do a bunch of this kind of work before they would transact on the deal. And so it was great to have him there and be instant validation. But again, as a privately held company, like if you have any aspirations of any sort of M&A over the next number of years, it would be wise for you to get ahead of this. Okay, and then let's talk about the last thing. So you might say, Mike, I am not a public company and I am not a privately held company that has any intention of selling anytime soon. Still, I would argue that there's some relevancy here. And the last piece I'll say is you have to realize if you're one of those two and you're saying, but I still sell to public companies or I sell products to companies that would care, this is where it's landing. And we're seeing this again. I'll come back to the automotive example. We do a lot of work in the automotive supply chain. We have a number of tier 1 and 2 and 3 supply chain clients, as well as we have a great relationship with General Motors and some of the other OEMs. And General Motors actually had us present last week at their 4th annual sustainability symposium. And they're going to their supply chain and saying, we're a public company. We have pressure to report our scope 1, 2, and 3s. We've set goals to be carbon neutral by 2040. We're going to produce all EVs by 2035. And General Motors is also saying for every ton of carbon that General Motors emits, their supply chain emits 11. I want that to sink in. That's a big deal. So if General Motors went carbon neutral themselves tomorrow, that would still be less than 10% of their total carbon emissions that are impacted. And so General Motors knows if they're going to do this, and this is not a General Motors thing, this is General Mills, this is all the people selling into Walmart and Target. There are a ton of top of the food chain publicly traded companies that are saying if we're going to decarbonize our operations, we need our supply chain to decarbonize their operations. And so this is the last piece where I'll say it doesn't matter if you're insulated from the other two, you likely are selling into those. And that is a huge consideration. If you want to keep growing your business, whether you're an automotive supplier or a furniture supplier, or again, you're selling to Target and Walmart, it is going to be a big deal over the next number of years that you can go to those companies and say, I am aligning with your goals. My company is aligning my goals with your goals. And therefore, if you buy more from us, you will be able to reach your goals more quickly. That is a compelling business argument. And that is where we're seeing companies go from seeing all of this disclosure as a sunk cost and a tax on them to an opportunity for them to gobble up market share from their competitors. They're saying, we are going to win. We're going to figure out what our clients want. And frankly, the beauty is it's all public at this point. These companies are making these big declarations and we're going to align with it. And we're going to win market share from our competitors who are too backwards looking and are not progressive enough to realize this is where the industry is moving and align. And then we have a number of clients that are taking that approach there, and they're already in the process of winning contracts that they said we wouldn't have had a shot at 2 and 3 years ago had we not been able to tell this compelling of a sustainability story. So I kind of want to finish there on don't see this as a major cost center. See this as an opportunity for you to grow your customer base. See this as an opportunity to insulate yourself from the risks of the uncertainty in the energy market and inflation and other items. This is the vision. I think that the companies that are getting proactive on this are looking at all this disclosure in that regard, as opposed to what is the government telling me to do next? What is BlackRock telling me to do next? What is General Motors or Steelcase or whoever I'm in the supply chain of telling me to do next? It's saying, no, I have agency in this and I'm going to win in doing it. And so that's really, I think, the big pieces I want to talk about of how we're seeing proactive businesses respond to a lot of this disclosure, not only for the SEC, but beyond, is saying this is our chance. There's been a big reshuffling over the last 2 years, and we're going to cement our place in the future as a strategic and valued partner for our customers, whether they're end users or our customers if we fit into the supply chain. want to pause there. I think there's probably some questions. I can certainly talk about other things, but I think we should make sure that we leave some time to be able to address any questions that anyone has around this.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you as well, Alex. We have a number of questions here, but the first one I'm going to ask, I think I'm going to direct this to Alex first. So, at least plurality of public traded companies are already disclosing a lot of information through things like the Climate Disclosure Project, and ones that are doing things in a more assertive way are participating in programs such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so I think you can make a case, and this is the pushback you're seeing with certain folks, that that there is already voluntary activity here. Can you talk a little about the expected differences between the current voluntary approach and an SEC mandated approach?
Sure. I've actually looked a lot at the frameworks that are out there. In the last 10 years, I would say there have been a number of different groups of businesses and civil society organizations and others who have gotten together to establish frameworks for disclosure of these kinds of risks. And many of them are very good. SASB has one, which is now the Value Reporting Initiative. There's CDP, there's a bunch of them. And they all use different terminology, and there are obviously overlaps. And what happened was when the Carbon Reporting Project did a big analysis of this and got a lot of companies to participate, what they learned from them was that, oh my gosh, this is just too many different frameworks. We can't report under all of these. And they felt compelled to report under all of them because they didn't know which of their customers or shareholders followed which one, and they felt like they had to comply with all to be able to say that they did. And what they really, really wanted was government to step in and sort of standardize it so that they could just do one framework of reporting. And so that's what is happening globally. It's happening already in Europe. And the value of it is that you standardize everything, you put it in a particular place in the financial statements and in the narrative report that companies file with the SEC. And that way investors can find the information, and there's a common understanding of what the terminology means. And over time, it can be improved, methodologies can be shared, and companies can learn from each other. I think having for example, the accelerated and large accelerated filers go first enables them to sort of iron things out with their resources and capacity, and that'll make it easier when smaller companies report and so forth. So I think that's the big value of it.
If I can add, Alex is spot on. Another piece we're seeing is things like the CDP are very much oriented towards supply chains and not necessarily oriented towards the financial markets. So sometimes you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And that's why Alex just talked about there's a push to standardize in the same way financials have to be disclosed in a specific way with generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP. They're trying to set that for carbon tracking as well. And that's, I think, a huge benefit. Things like CDP are great, but again, that's more of like Walmart pushes all their suppliers to fill out the CDP so they can have a standardized platform to understand what's going on. So it's a little bit of a different setup. And then SBTI is certainly the most intense and valuable. But again, you have to be pretty far along in your journey to be able to engage in the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so I think I will agree there is a gap, and that is what the SEC is trying to fill. Is there's too many different ways to report this. Can we standardize it? And certainly I don't think like CDP will go away. What'll end up happening is specific industries that use the CDP information will find that still continually valuable, but everyone will be able to get the similar framework on the carbon side of things from a financial reporting standpoint.
I'm going to turn to some of our hosts online or questions on that in the chat here. Joyce is asking about stranded assets. How are they defined in the climate disclosure? How easy is it for a real estate asset to become a stranded asset? Any thoughts on this?
I'm looking at you, Alex.
Oh, okay. I think if I understand the question correctly, it actually is something that happens over a certain amount of time. But what happens is that you have an asset and it maybe is a fossil fuel controlled asset, runs by fossil fuel. And then the technology in the industry changes and everybody's using a new technology that's much more efficient. And all of a sudden, an asset that you were doing accounting for over, say, a 20 or 30-year period, associating cost and income ratably across those 30 years, all of a sudden it looks like you won't get any income associated with it after the next 10 years, and it's going to be stranded because you're going to have to invest in a different kind of technology to keep up with your competitors. And so the asset becomes stranded and you can't associate income with it because you're in effect not using it. And that's a big problem, because when companies make major investments in equipment, they both deduct the cost of it ratably over the period of its useful life, and then they also ratably assign income to it over the period of its useful life. And the changes in technology interrupt that. Does that make sense? I didn't explain that very clearly.
I believe so. Joyce, does that answer your question?
Oh, good.
She said, thanks, it was great. The specific question from Sarah Meyer: what are accelerated and large accelerated filers?
I can answer that. So large accelerated filers are companies that the word accelerated relates to how quickly after the end of a year companies have to file their reports with the SEC. And so accelerated filers have to file their reports faster than smaller companies, and large accelerated filers have to file their reports even faster than accelerated filers. But an accelerated filer is a filer that has a public float, that is public shares outstanding, of between 75 million and 700 million globally. A large accelerated filer has a public float in excess of 700 million. And a smaller reporting company, which, as I pointed out, is exempt from reporting Scope 3 emissions, is basically a company that has a public float of 250 million or less. But they could also have a float of up to 700 million as long as their revenues were less than 100 million. It's a little confusing, but so if you fit within the smaller company exemption, you don't have to report Scope 3 no matter what.
Okay. Would filers discuss or offsets, carbon credits purchased in the narrative section, or is this information not assessed at all?
Oh yeah, they can discuss it in the narrative section for sure.
Yeah, and they're in their 10K, so there's going to be the formal like reporting again, like in the same way you have to report your financials. You can still add a lot of commentary to your financials, and most publicly traded companies do. So certainly that will be happen. There's a standardized way to report it, and then they will have a narrative saying, hey, these are all of our emissions. By the way, we're offsetting, I'll make it up, 90% of them with RECs and carbon offsets, et cetera. And that would all be in a narrative section.
I had a question, and I know the answer to this, but I'm going to tee it over as well. Will these requirements apply to investor-owned utilities, and any speculation on how this might impact their operations, given they are also regulated at the state level?
Yeah. Again, based on the different criteria that Alex talked about, but most of the like DTE and consumers here in Michigan are both large publicly traded companies. I imagine they would be responsible for the 1, 2, and 3 requirements. And then certainly, well, this is what you got to remember. And this is exactly what Alex said. This is a mandate to report this stuff out. There's no mandate on improving or doing anything differently. I would guess potentially all these IOUs, investor-owned utilities, that is, are not going to like how bad they look when they have to put all this out, and there may be more of an appetite, but it's hard to speculate. The reality is, I always say transparency is always good. You can't manage what you don't measure. And so if you're measuring this and reporting on this, I think it's good accountability. What you might see is the worst IOUs across the country getting the biggest screws put in them. And those IOUs are certainly going to be the ones that are fossil heavy and not renewable heavy. So that's maybe a speculation, is you'll just see like ESG funds, et cetera, are going to go to all the IOUs and say, hey, you three are the worst. We're not going to put you in, and you three are the best. We're going to put you in our ESG fund. And obviously that has implications on their share price. I don't know, Alex, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I think that was about right.
Yeah, and I think also, I believe the SEC is going to be asked for things that at least the state of Michigan is not asking for, because I think the state is more invested in generation and where the power comes from, and the percentages there, and its specific emissions. I don't think the state generally gets involved in asking any of its industries to calculate to calculate greenhouse gases in this manner. Would that be a shared understanding there?
I'm not actually familiar with the Michigan rules.
Okay.
On that, but
Yeah, and I'm more familiar with the Michigan than the federal stuff. I think, based on how I understand that is the case, but I don't want to say with certainty.
I'm fairly certain that's like there are distinct differences between what between what the state and federal government are regulating in these cases.
Yeah. When I think about like utilities on a state level, it's like air permits, et cetera, and that does require some carbon reporting, as I understand it anyway. And so that would be the extent of it, where this again is a very like financially driven, organized approach to reporting emissions.
Yeah, we've got finally a question about ISO 5001, which overlaps with a lot of these companies. And this is probably, I think, a question for you, Mike. Is that becoming more relevant, popular now to more transparently comply with regulations such as this?
Absolutely. So ISO 50001 is, so those of you familiar with ISO 14001 is an environmental management system. So all the environmental stuff. 9001, I believe, is quality. 50,001 is pretty new. It's energy. It's an energy management system. So in the same way, in the environmental management system, you're managing your chemicals and all the other things on site. 50,001, you're managing your utilities, electric, gas, water, et cetera. And it is certainly becoming significantly more popular. 5 years ago, there was hardly any companies in North America that had ISO 50001. Now we're starting to see a number of them look at it, especially in the automotive vertical. I think the Japanese, if I remember right, maybe the Europeans, one of the two. So it's either like Toyota and Honda or Volkswagen and Mercedes. Anyway, some group of them are starting to push on it. So we're seeing it happen more. I'll say this, having an ISO 50001 management system implemented at your organization will help you collect the majority of the data you would need to report your scope 1 and 2 and even 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So the short answer is, if you do ISO 50001, it's going to put you in a really good spot to comply. If you're thinking, I'm going to do ISO 50001 and that will make me comply to this SEC ruling, that would not be the case, in the fact that, again, there's very specific requirements around how you report. But again, 50001 would give you the infrastructure you need to collect the data to be able to report on it.
I think this is a question for you, Alex. Assuming these rules do move forward, how durable do we expect this ruling to be? Because there are a lot of there's a lot of climate forward rules and regulation that tend to not outlive changes of administration. And I think we saw that with the Obama administration kind of switching with the Trump administration, and a lot of the foundational work at that time it was either eroded or erased. would we expect something similar with the SEC ruling? Is that more durable, less durable?
It's really hard to say. I think that no doubt there are going to be court challenges, as I said earlier. We certainly expect that. The SEC, though, has crafted a rule that is really quite in line with its legal authorities going way back. They went out of their way not to do certain things that I think could have been challenged. But especially like with the financial statement and showing, it's directly linked to the financial impact in the financial statements, for example. And it's just about climate risk, and I think it's indisputable that climate risk is a factor in the valuation of companies now going forward. We already see that. So I think that, that means that it's going to be fairly durable in the courts, I think. But, who knows? And then the other thing is what Mike was referring to is that, there's this rule is not by itself. It's in a context where so many people, so many companies are already doing so much in this area. It seems unlikely that it would just go away completely. The rule is being finalized, hopefully 2 years, hopefully, before this current administration ends. So even if, there's a new administration at the end of this one, I think that by then this practice of looking at climate risk and disclosing it will be so much a part of the markets that it seems like it wouldn't go away. But we could definitely see changes in the rule. We could see parts of the rule struck down. It's hard to say.
I'll also be interested in seeing what industries fight this relative to others. To your point, Alex,
Yeah.
I just don't. There's a lot of industries that you'd think historically would fight stuff like this that are already doing a lot of it and probably won't invest the resources. And in some regards, you're going to see this you're going to see this as a tax on the IOUs, investor-owned utilities, and O&G, oil and gas. Like I think I could see them fighting this as hard as they can, but if they're doing it alone, certainly they have a lot of authority. But it's a lot easier to knock something like this down when you have all of the business community unified. Where like especially when you think about tech being such a big piece of our economy, the tech companies are already doing all this. This is not going to be a hard thing for them to comply with. I just don't see them fighting it like the oil and gas and investor-owned utilities do.
And you actually raise yet another point, Mike, about this is that technology itself is enabling companies to track and, determine these risks and emissions and things already. It's not like, even 10 years ago when the software and the ability to do these kinds of calculations and so forth didn't exist or was in its infancy. I think now it's a lot easier and there are a lot more resources that companies can go to make these kinds of calculations.
Well, thank you so much again, Alex, for taking the time to speak to us today. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for taking the time. We'll learn quite a bit here. For anyone that's interested in potentially engaging in the open comment period, which is again open until June 17th, so next week. We are partnering with the climate action campaign to help introduce people to that process. And when you log off this webinar, you'll see a brief survey that just says whether or not you found this helpful. And if you are interested in learning more about commenting, just go ahead and click yes, and one of our colleagues will reach out to you. Also, if you're in the West, if you're in the Michigan area, please do consider attending our annual meeting later this month on June 27th. And finally, thank you so much, Alex and Mike, for being with us today. And thank you everyone for giving us your time to learn a little bit about how the SEC is potentially going to encourage increased climate disclosures.
Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.